talking to you all. So, I mean, as Laura said, you know, I work for Amnesty International, and I've been there for a while, and been working really in human rights and in international NGOs for all my career. Obviously an EYPer, and started in EYP in 2001. My first session was Stockholm, and my last session was Potsdam in 2007, where I presided that international session. I was a member of the GB, a bunch of national sessions. So, you know, EYP is very much part of my, you know, my background and what made me the, you know, the professional that I am today. So it's great to be able to connect back with that community. So what I wanted to talk to you today is, as Laura said, I don't want to do a lecture, you know, I just want to share with you some of my reflections and thoughts, you know, having worked on human rights for, what is it, almost 15 years. What does it mean today to work on human rights? And what are some of the challenges that, you know, I've been facing, and some of the challenges that you might be facing as well if you entered into that sector, but also looking at some opportunities that are coming our way, and some of the ideas and solutions that I want to discuss with you and hear what you think. So I'll just share, I've got some slides just to help us get through that. So I am going to do that now. So I hope you can see that. Yeah, great. So really my, where I want to bring my work and what I'm doing right now is the fact that I've been working for the past year or so on developing Amnesty's global strategy for the next 10 years or so. You know, it's quite a big undertaking, obviously, and in doing that, I've done a lot of work sort of reflecting on the state of human rights today in the world, and what are some of those challenges and opportunities. So that's kind of the lens that I'll bring to this call. I can't see anyone, so for whatever reason, Laura, I can only see you, so if for whatever reason something goes wrong, just make a gesture or something. So very briefly, I mean, in terms of human rights, you know, what do we mean by human rights? Just very briefly, obviously, you know, the modern human rights framework that we work on with today, as we know, is a product of many centuries and decades of philosophical thinking, but legally we're looking at the international system that was established after the Second World War, that really was kicked off with the International Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 by the UN, which really contained that enunciation of you know, the Bill of Rights, essentially, that we work on with today, and certainly Amnesty works with. Since 1948, you know, there's been a plethora of development of international treaties codifying those rights into law and creating obligations on states to implement those rights. So looking at issues of torture, violence against women, economic, social, and cultural rights, there's been a huge development of soft and hard law on all the rights that are outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So just for the purpose of the conversation, I guess, you know, the subjects of international human rights law are governments, right? And governments who decide to hold each other accountable for violation of this international law. Over the past 20, 30 years, obviously, we've seen many successes of the human rights framework, from increased protection of minorities, to, you know, criminal special courts that have been set up, you know, from the ICC to special tribunals. We've also seen many challenges, obviously, always driven by big historical events. We've seen really the Cold War being the stage really for much of the human rights advocacy in the 80s. We've seen with 9/11 a huge challenge posed on human rights, with security had to take the priority over human rights. So there's always been challenges, you know, to the work of human rights. But I think what we've seen in the past 5 years is, you know, definitely a new wave of challenges when it comes to working on human rights. So I just wanted to touch upon those a little bit, really. What is today's context? I mean, those pictures probably speak for themselves. You know, we live in an ever more complex world where challenges to human rights are coming from all directions. You know, first of all, we've got the global refugee crisis, which really is seeing the highest peak of, you know, at the highest peak of the crisis, we were seeing the highest number of people displaced since the Second World War. So this has been a huge challenge for those working on human rights, and the issue has definitely taken quite a strong predominance for the past, you know, 5 years. And then we've seen, you know, you know, some say it's the rise of populist leaders, right? Though I don't love the word populist associated to leaders, but we've seen it, you know, from the USA to India, from Brazil to Hungary. We see political leaders are skillfully focusing on narratives of fear and division, and doing that successfully. So these political leaders are getting elected, they're getting wide public support, really resorting to othering as a way of getting, you know, support. And we've seen that these are obviously incredibly divisive narratives, and you know, they're also aided by technology, and these are becoming increasingly normalized, these narratives around us versus them, and that's posed a huge challenge for the protection of human rights. I mean, technology, as I said, obviously the rapidly evolution of technology has really disrupted our work from two perspectives. You know, in one way, it's creating an echo chamber that's keeping us more divided and into stronger and more divided opinion groups. But we've also seen tech companies have unparalleled power. And, you know, the harvesting of personal data that we see as a business model for tech companies is something that's raising huge concerns from a human rights perspective. So that's a whole new area of work that we really need to be looking into. And obviously we've got the ongoing crisis, which is COVID-19, kind of really ripping off the lid on all the inequalities that we see in the world. You know, when COVID-19 started, we thought, you know, some were saying it's a great equalizer, it doesn't discriminate. But actually we see that those who are hit the most are the ones who are the poorest, who are more marginalized, and that's a symptom of kind of systemic inequality that we see in society. Plus, you know, just on top of everything else, the climate crisis that we know is heading our way strong and steady. So, you know, incredibly challenging context. So when trying to develop, you know, human rights campaigns in this context, when trying to decide what should be the priorities for a big organization like Amnesty International for the next 10 years, you know, there's been a lot of interesting conversations, but what's been interesting for me is that I'm seeing, and we're seeing some challenges emerging really around the concept of human rights, not so much on individual issues, and they all have their challenges, but there are interesting points to reflect on. What do human rights mean today, and what does it mean for an organization and for people to be talking about human rights and working on human rights? So what I want to do is, you know, kind of identify sort of 4 challenges that I see emerging. The first one is what we're referring to as the solidarity challenge, where we see these supremacist politics essentially setting the agenda. So we've seen these populist leaders that, you know, are getting elected and getting a lot of support, talking about the need to look after our own first, right? And this is a rhetoric which is enjoying a lot of popular support. But we're also seeing that there isn't an alternative to this. We're seeing that in many countries, including countries where human rights are part of the political debate and political discourse, we're seeing that the opposition those who are in opposition to these populist leaders are unable to provide an alternative narrative that is engaging. It's making the opposition, it's putting the opposition in a very defensive way, and in some cases, it's even normalizing, policies that are, not in line with human rights standards. So we're seeing there is therefore this perception that there is a lack of an alternative, that this is just the way that things need to happen. And so the result of that is that, these populist and divisive narratives end up shaping the political agenda of those who are in power, but also of those who are in opposition to power. So, we've seen it in Europe, obviously, with the tightening of immigration has become something that is now widely accepted as something that needs to happen across the political spectrum. And that poses a real concern a real challenge when you're trying to work on, trying to promote human rights, proactive policies. And a lot of the international agreements that the EU has, negotiated with regards to migration and refugees are a product of that. For sure. So, obviously the reason is that, because of the political support that these narratives have, politicians are not willing to show unpopular alternatives. And this is a big challenge. The second challenge is the universality challenge. So what we're seeing is a selective rejection of human rights. Really few leaders are going to directly criticize the human rights framework in its entirety, but many do criticize the idea that of particular rights for particular groups and attack any institution that's set up to design to protect those rights. So, obviously human rights have long been associated by their eminent enemies with foreign values or agenda, or being the product of liberal and international elites. But these narratives are on the rise, and they're becoming increasingly an obstacle for those who advocate for human rights. And it's been interesting to see that affect also countries that are traditionally supportive of human rights. And I think in the case of Europe, this is even more worrying. We've seen recently, for example, in the case of Denmark, who's been one of the founders of the Refugee Convention, the Danish government themselves challenging the very concept of such a convention, and arguing that the full spectrum of rights shouldn't, in fact, be afforded to refugees and to refugees. So this is a real concern, that obviously those who bear the brunt are usually these minorities, or these groups of people that the human rights framework is instead trying to protect. So a rejection of particular rights for particular groups, but also we're seeing an attempt to delegitimize any national or international institution that's designed to protect human rights. I mean, the most obvious example of that is the European Court of Human Rights. There's been several attempts by governments to, the language that's usually used is around, oh, we want to modernize, we just want to bring it up to speed with today's human rights framework, and that raises all sorts of challenges. I think, if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were to be negotiated today, it would definitely not be as progressive as it is today. So reopening any kind of sort of international institutional court structure is a real danger. And it's the same thing that's happening in the International Criminal Court, that we're seeing, this being really challenged in so many different directions, and trying to undermine its role. So again, that's a big challenge there around the universality of human rights. The third challenge is the priority challenge. So one that pits human rights against other preoccupations, security, the economy. Obviously, this becomes incredibly relevant at times of crisis. So whenever there is a crisis, we are often presented with a choice that you either protect human rights or you protect security or you look after the economy. This obviously happened famously after 9/11 with torture and other human rights issues. But we're seeing the same happening with COVID-19, where there is a false choice being put in front of us between human rights and the protection of public health. And we've seen many legislations that have been pieces of legislation that have been put forward, very much trying to restrict civil liberties and human rights in the name of some sort of greater good. And we know that's also simply not effective. We've seen that with 9/11 and and across history for sure. Counterterrorism has become particularly effective as a context that is seen almost as a zero-sum game with human rights. So you either look at protecting the human rights of terrorists, or you try and protect the society and the people. So that's a challenge. that keeps being that I think we keep facing. And I promise it's not all gloom and doom. I mean, there's some reasons to be optimism. But finally, is the effectiveness challenge. Human rights just don't resonate with the majority of people, and this is something that has been quite hard, I think, for big organizations to, like Amnesty or like even the European Union and the UN to come to terms with. But human rights organizations haven't been effective in convincing societies that human rights really apply to all of them and that are effectively going to be beneficial for the majority of people. Usually human rights, and we've done some work to understand what are the perceptions of human rights, that we're seeing human rights seen by people as something that are for other people, not for themselves, usually for maybe minorities or groups that are particularly disadvantaged. And this is obviously not true. I think especially when it comes to, a lot of the preoccupations that everybody has around their health, around their education, these are human rights issues. And organizations, including Amnesty, haven't done a good enough job to frame these issues as human rights issues. And this goes back to, also a bit of an unhelpful distinction between civil and political rights on one hand and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand. And this is probably a reflection of also some of the power imbalances that were there, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. But there is certainly a sense that civil and political rights were more important than, so looking at freedom of expression and torture and physical violence, that were more important than economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, it's important to frame also economic, social, and cultural issues as human rights issues, so that people can see the benefit of human rights to apply to their lives. But there are some opportunities and reasons, again, to be hopeful about. Look, I think this is something I'm sure you've all we're seeing today being played out in the streets of Belarus, to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, but really going back to the Arab Spring now, sort of 10 years ago, where social movements, we're seeing social movements having a new vigor and energy ignited into them. And what's interesting is that we're seeing these movements often being leaderless. They're often they're not developed around an organization. They're quite organic. They start as organizing and self-organizing movements. We've seen them, in Hong Kong and Poland and Chile, that really are resonating with authorities, and they are, to some extent, helping to shape the conversation especially around inequality and injustice. And this is something that, organizations like Amnesty, we can try and capitalize on. How can we, capitalize on is not the right word, but how can we amplify and support these movements to make sure that, you know, they are as effective and influential as possible when it comes to the protection of human rights. The second, you know, opportunity is, you know, this sense around wanting to challenge systemic. Oops, sorry, my screen sharing is gone. Okay. I think there's a strong, and this is linked to the point around social movements, that I think we're moving to at a time where we're moving from individual single choice causes to understanding that causes are much more connected. You know, and we see this in these movements that, yes, we're talking about climate change in a lot of context, but this is also linked to inequality, it's linked to systemic injustice. So there's an understanding that issues are much more connected and that we are part of not just a one single issue challenge, but that we're really trying to change the system in a way. And I know that sounds a bit maybe scary and a bit nebulous, but I feel that the public is getting more accustomed to see issues as more interconnected with each other. And again, I think the pandemic and COVID-19 has also been, you know, a catalyst for that. It's not just about health, it's also about you know, the right to work, it's about the right to movement, it's about reducing pollution. So, and this is certainly, I think, awakening the public to bigger demands and more, and maybe being better linked to these sort of movements. Finally, I think, you know, the human rights framework is constantly evolving, and I think there are some new areas that I think don't have a very strong human rights framing around them. And this is an opportunity because organizations who work on human rights and specialize on human rights can really help shape those agendas. And I think especially work on technology and what I mentioned earlier around these sort of data cartels that are almost like developing by big tech companies, how data is harvested and used, is something that at the moment, there's not really a clear human rights framework around it. And what does it mean for human rights? So being able as organizations to have a say in that is an opportunity to shape these areas of work. But it's not just about, you know, an expanding human rights arena from a thematic perspective, but also in terms of the types of actors who are advocating for human rights. It's not just about NGOs anymore. You know, there's a lot of new actors coming in the part of the ecosystem of protecting human rights. Social movements obviously is one of them, movements that are not connected to organizations, but there's a lot happening as well in the corporate sector. You know, I think we've seen, some call it brand activism. We've seen some big brands being very bold about their advocacy and their activism with regards to human rights. You know, some may see that, you know, cynically as saying it's a financial consideration, and that's because, you know, it is seen as profitable. But they are powerful actors, and they come with resources, and they come with influence, and they too can really help promote the human rights agenda and the human rights framework. So those are some of the opportunities, and I'm sure there's more. And again, I'm really just touching the surface here for us to start a conversation. Now, in terms of, let me just. Okay, so how do we go forward? Just a couple of ideas that I want to share with you in terms of how, yes, organizations like Amnesty are thinking about, you know, developing an approach and a strategy in such a complex time, but that maybe might be relevant to others who want to work in the human rights sector as well. The first issue, you know, it's a bit of a tricky one, but, you know, choosing issues that resonate widely. And I think this is making sure really that organizations like Amnesty and others NGOs have a portfolio of work that really is quite balanced in terms of, yes, working for the most vulnerable and working for those who are most in need, has to remain a priority, and it's often an unpopular priority, but we also need to expand our portfolio to work on issues, for example, like economic, social, and cultural rights. An interesting, example of this was, when we were working on the issue of providing healthcare to asylum seekers in Greece, and we were in the island of Lesbos, and we were developing this campaign, and we were seeing that the public was so hard to engage the public on this, especially in the location. And from talking to some people, they were saying, well, you're advocating for healthcare for asylum seekers when the Greek health system is really challenging, and it's really not protecting even its citizens. So, it's something that it's important for organizations to hear and understand, and so I think certainly from the perspective of Amnesty International, our ambition is to do much more work on economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to health. And for example, looking at the impact of austerity policies on school, on hospitals, on the provision of services, issues that some people might not see as human rights issues, but we can frame that as such, and people can see really the benefit of this work for them. The other point is, I know it sounds a bit corny, but it's speaking to the heart. Amnesty and many NGOs are really born from the theory of change is that we expose human rights abuses, and we let the world know that some bad things have happened. And when people know that bad things are happening, they're going to change their mind. We're seeing that that's not necessarily happening. Some say that we live in a post-truth world where facts don't matter anymore. And that's something that, affects, research-based organizations like Amnesty. So we need to invest much more in our communications and making sure that they speak to, again, we've done some research on this, that we need to appeal to people's values much more rather than bringing them with hard facts. So it's a challenging piece of work, but one which I think we're willing to invest in. Diversity, movement diversity is essential. I think if one of the challenges that I was talking about earlier is looking at, the fact that, sometimes movement organizations like Amnesty are identified as a primarily liberal, bunch of liberals, based in Northern Europe. There is a truth in that, in the sense that our movement isn't as diverse as we want it to be. And making sure that we become more attractive and more inclusive as an organization and as a movement will also make our work more, more reflecting of, what society wants and needs. So that's something that we will be working on as well. The other point is focusing on community organizing as well. We've definitely seen that in some of these movements that are getting a lot of traction really start from local grassroots organizing. And, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's an important role for activism and digital mobilization to play, but people are getting a little bit tired of petitions. And we really need to be able to offer those who want to take action more options for things to do. And that includes organizing within the local communities, just to do things that are more practical, whether it's welcoming refugees in their homes or setting up a local advocacy group with the mayor in their town. But it's also around creating a community where people feel that they belong. And I think this is something that we feel, when Amnesty was created, there weren't many organizations like that, and now there are so many demands on people's time that, we think there is an opportunity for NGOs and those who work on human rights to really create a community where people share their own values. one of the interesting things that we were looking at is, if you look at in the United States at the success of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, one of the reasons why that's such a strong network is because people really feel that they belong to a community. And that's something that, those who work for human rights need to start working towards as well. And finally, increasing cooperation within the social justice ecosystem. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of new actors on the horizon. It's not just about NGOs anymore. There's smaller organizations, grassroots organizations, movements, corporate, multinational organizations, foundations, and, we need to be collaborating much more with one another, understanding where we all add value, what our strengths and what our weaknesses are. So those are some ideas. I would like to hear what you think about all of this. I've been, blabbing for half an hour. Before opening up for questions, I wanted to do a little poll with you. So looking at these 5 options there, 5 ideas that I've put forward, which ones do you think are the most important ones, the ones that you think will make really human rights work and advocacy more effective? So have a think about that. And I want to use Mentimeter in case any of you are familiar with that. So if you go on, take your phone and go to www.menti.com and insert code 9464339, you should see, I'm going to stop sharing now. You should see that. Let me just open the Mentimeter because I need to do that. Okay. Is that working for people? Can people see this?
Yes,
so
I can see the poll.
The code is 9464339. And I am going to share my screen again so we can see the results. You can vote up to 3 times. You can choose up to 3, I should have said.
I completely missed that. I voted for 1. Oh, too bad.
Great. So great to see. Cooperation is always at the top of everyone's, everyone's minds. It's easier said than done most times, but building movement diversity, yes, is great to see that coming up as well. So great, thank you so much for those thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing and really bring it over to you now. If anyone has any questions, clarifications, or anything that you wildly disagree with what I said or agree, please, let's make this a conversation. I think it's not a big group, so you just feel free to, I think, unmute yourself and go for it if you want.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria, perhaps to break the ice. Thanks so much, Danny, for the great talk. Always a pleasure to hear you talk about this. What I was thinking about when you were talking about the challenges and everything, another thing that came to my mind is that to me it also seems like a challenge to keep track of all of the different human rights, NGOs and UN bodies and everything in terms of what I as an individual decide to support or get engaged with. So also why I selected the option of community organizing, because I'm wondering whether after a proliferation of human rights organizations, whether you think, would there be a way or would it make sense to somehow start building more communities so that it's easier to centralize all the efforts rather than having a lot of them try to catch the attention of the same individuals for rather similar human rights issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and I think that's something that, you know, we're struggling with, because I think even the concept of solidarity and what it means today to be in solidarity with others, I think has changed. You know, I think an organization like Amnesty was born on the idea that, you know, you have people in a country writing letters to a different country so that you would get them to do X, Y, and Z. So a very, very understanding the global kind of pressure. But we're seeing, because of all of those challenges that I've talked about, we're seeing that still works in some cases, but the window is shrinking for the times where that works, you know. And I think local pressure is where we're seeing some of the more interesting influencing happening, you know. So you know, some would say it's most valuable if that pressure comes from the immediate community that is being affected from an issue. And in fact, in some cases, if there's pressure from people from a different country, it's like, why are you, you know, why are you telling us what to do? Like, we're unfortunately living in a much less, you know, connected world, and everybody's looking at their own first. And so I think that might be one of the reasons why grassroots organizing and local organizing is really thriving. Because I think it also feels very tangible. And I think that's also linked to the fact that I think urban actors are also interestingly claiming an important space in the protection of human rights, that usually it was seen as the central government is where everything happens, and therefore it's at the UN that you can influence them. But actually there's a lot that happens at the town level. We've seen that with the issue of refugees and migrants, for example, you know, that a lot of these issues are really local in nature. So yeah, I think, you know, I think that is where a lot of energy is going. And it's an interesting challenge for an organization like Amnesty to think about how can we then add value to that, you know, when we're really built, and a lot of organizations are built in this international, you know, ecosystem. We have great access to the United Nations, but is that gonna, you know, trickle down to what happens in a municipality in Marseille? That's the tricky bit.
Hi, Siraina here. I'm just having a thought. How would you balance this maybe preponderance or more usefulness of community and grassroots level organizing with the protection of human rights defenders in regions where people still have to be afraid of repression, and, you know, people would be, you know, hauled into jail for speaking out? How do you have any experience in that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, in fact, you know, when I was saying earlier, there are some areas of work where international solidarity is still quite effective. I think the protection of human rights defenders is one of those, and we see that. You know, we see that in all, you know, all the casework that we do, whereby just by showing authorities that some individuals are enjoying global support is something that will give them some protection or some status. You know, sometimes it's a double-edged sword for some of those, you know, human rights defenders, but we're seeing that still does work. I think we're seeing the use of relief as being quite strategically done, can be really helpful by big global human rights organizations, providing relief support for human rights defenders to either pay for legal fees whenever they get constantly attacked with charges and unfair charges, but also if they need to move away from a country, and they need support for doing that. So I think that's actually an example where I think international solidarity, I would even say in some cases, is more effective than community organizing, because then the risk is at the local level, right? So you don't want to expose those local groups to further exposure and further and further harassment. So yes, there's definitely a role there to be played.
Awesome, thank you. If I may just actually also segue into my own question, because you working at Amnesty will have a very unique perspective on this. I also want to hear what other people in that call think. Is what we tend to hear a bit more and more often is the framing of human rights as a predominantly Western framework. And I was wondering also for Amnesty, there's probably some work done, and what kind of works do you do also on finding protection norms in Sharia law, for example, in traditional Chinese law that has like very different sources. So I was wondering how that looks for Amnesty, and also maybe address other participants if that's also something they've seen, and how they feel about probably most of us actually being Western Europeans or Europeans, how they feel about this issue.
Yeah, it would be great to hear others as well. I mean, this is it's a really interesting and thorny issue. I mean, I think, I think there is some truth in the fact that, human rights language and the human rights framework may be perceived as having been primarily a tool of Western government. As I think we just have to acknowledge that there's an historical, colonial and balance in power there. But I think, I work a lot with, obviously sections in Africa and in the Americas region. And I think for me, it comes down to the two things, is that, you don't always need to use the words human rights if that is unhelpful, in certain contexts. And that's why it kind of goes back. I was going back to kind of values, that it's about justice, it's about equality, it's kind of slightly broader frames. But I also think it is about the choice of issues as well that we work on. I think, when you talk to, especially African and Latin American sections, really looking at the how resources are used by governments to provide services in terms of health, education, is something that really does resonate with people in I'm just going to say the global South. Just it's a bit of a blanket term, but to me it's very interesting because there's also a reason why those issues haven't been worked on by a lot of big INGOs, because in Europe those are very political issues. Those are very nobody, and now more than ever, nobody wants to be associated with radical left-wing policies around challenging capitalism, right? And certainly Amnesty doesn't do that and doesn't want to do that. So some of these issues are controversial and political for, say, a European audience, but actually they're quite they're very important for people in other countries. So I think there's something there. I mean, the issue of what we're looking at, other types of laws, Sharia law, even looking at indigenous people's kind of like framings, that is a tricky one. And I think, again, I go back to language is important and the terms that you use. For example, you know, I think sometimes we revert to, oh, the rule of law, there needs to be respect for the rule of law, you know. Well, the rule of law sometimes is the tool of the oppressor, right? And in the face of indigenous communities, for example, that would be the case. So we just have to be careful again about, for me, I think an organization like Amnesty can be clear that it is the international human rights framework that provides the parameter for its work, but then it can engage with partners and others using different language as well. But I would be curious to hear what others think.
Well, maybe, yeah, sorry to be hogging the microphone a bit here, but yeah, you mentioned this earlier. What I also noticed is that sometimes you cannot use the words, you know, human and rights in the same sentence unless you want your partners to shut down. So this is also something I had written down earlier, like how do you then pragmatically like choose your issues, like when you have to like, you know, pick your battles, and when you do have to change your language, as you said, to like kind of adapt to the cultural context. How, yeah, for someone who works in Amnesty, you know, how does it feel to maybe sometimes have to address, you know, more general ones instead of, you know, really insisting on, oh, the norm says this and that, and you have to do this and that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, you know, and I think it's in big organizations, that's a lot of the internal kind of machinations. For me, it's always about having a strong strategy, like being very clear what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then adapting your work to achieving that objective. And I think you'll only be able to do that if you've really mapped out very clearly, you know, what do the stakeholders around you feel and think, you know, and you adapt your content and your language to really speak to them. Now, it's increasingly harder to do that when you're working at a global level, because you can't always control the narrative and control the message. But if you, so that sometimes doesn't always work when you're like a global organization. But if you are very specific about who you're trying to target and who you're trying to influence, you can do it, you know. And I think sometimes an organization like Amnesty, you know, we rarely work alone, right? We work with other partners and other organizations. And in some cases, you know, big NGOs need to be ready to take a step back and disappear, right? In terms of from a brand perspective, from a language perspective, and understanding that there are different ways that we can add value to a certain issue. Like, you know, in some cases, you know, by coming forward and saying, yes, Amnesty International is behind this cause, can really help small organizations justify their work. But in other cases, you know, maybe what we bring to the table is an investigation that we've done, but then actually we need other organizations to be at the forefront of that work. You know, so there's a lot that you can do there in terms of, yes, it's not whether you work on an issue or not. A lot of the times is how you work on an issue and understanding what is your added value as an organization, and just focusing on those strengths really. And that will always be a conversation with the people that you work with, because rarely you'll be completely on your own to achieve a certain search campaign or piece of advocacy.
Yeah, thank you. Very insightful. I'll pass the floor to others.
So I received a question from someone who I think they're doing two things at the same time, so it's difficult to unmute. But you mentioned that Amnesty International was reluctant to sort of associate itself with radical left-wing policies, and they were wondering how so? Why is this? Where does this reluctance come from?
Well, I think, again, it's a really great question, really topical. So Amnesty is an apolitical organization. We are impartial, right? And many organizations try and do that. A lot of NGOs do that. now, so, but what we mean by that is that we will, Amnesty will never side with a certain political party, right? It's always about, well, the lens that we bring is always of the human rights analysis, right? So, you know, that's something that, you know, we strive to do. Now, most people would probably say that Amnesty is a political organization, right? Because we sometimes do, you know, say things that are political in nature with a small p, if you know what I mean. So, you know, we would never go out and say, oh, we are against capitalism, you know. But we would say we are against policies that would violate the right to health. And some of those policies might be linked to capitalism, right? So we you know, it's always about striking a balance, right? You know, I think the risk is that, you know, as we move into working more on economic, social, and cultural rights, for example, on the impact of austerity, inevitably people will, sorry, I'm just trying to phrase this. So, for example, the impact on austerity is a very political issue, right? Is an issue that, you know, economic policies of austerity are usually associated with more kind of right-wing, you know, parties, anti-austerity policies are more from a left-wing policy. So the risk is, if Amnesty comes out and say, we are against austerity because it violates human rights, that people will say, oh, you're a leftist radical organization. I was like, no, we're not. We're just applying the human rights lens to this policy. And in this case, you know, it is to some extent in line with what, you know, parties on that side are saying. But it's just something we always have to be mindful about. We are not political, and we try to remain impartial. But sometimes, inevitably, working for the protection of human rights will send a message that we are actually political, because some of those issues are political. I mean, in the States is where things are so divided right now. You know, Amnesty USA, whenever Amnesty USA tries to work on the right to health, you know, Dave's like, oh, you're radical socialists, right? You know, immediately. When Action was like, no, this is actually the international human rights obligation. Like, it's the, you know, so it's a tricky thing to navigate, you know, as you can imagine. But, you know, in a way, having the international human rights framework as a parameter is helpful, because you can always fall back to that. Like, there is a body of law, of soft law and hard law, that is there, you know, and it's been internationally agreed, and it's apolitical. So it is a helpful protective, you know, shield, you know, from political attacks. Now, there are organizations that don't mind, you know, and, you know, don't mind being associated and being more political. You know, an organization like Amnesty is lucky to have, I think, to have such a frame that can help really bring a lens of analysis to the work. Maria, yeah?
I wanted to see if anyone else has a question, but I'll jump in again. I was wondering, I read a bit in recent years that there seems to have been a movement on mental health, I guess in all industries, but also more attention given to how hard it is to work in human rights. And I remember when I was working in a similar field, international criminal law, it's just, you know, bad news constantly almost. And I guess it can feel very easy to be, to feel helpless, or, you know, it's too much to address it. I'm wondering if because it's been a few years, if I'm not mistaken, since this became in the spotlight, if you saw a change in the industry, and to the extent you feel like sharing, how do you deal with it yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the focus on well-being and, you know, what's essentially is, you know, stress related to work, but also looking really at trauma and what trauma does to you is something that I think the sector is finally waking up to. I'd say it's definitely catching up with the sector. And I think we're seeing a lot of big NGOs, especially acknowledging sort of staff well-being and investing much more in staff well-being, both from a, you know, from a just simply work-life balance to also looking at trauma, and especially those who are on the front line. So all I can say is that there's definitely now a lot of investment in this. And, you know, because I think it's also, yes, it's about the work, but I think it's also, you know, the people that are attracted to this work. You know, there's definitely a sense of selflessness and a sense of, you know, because you're doing it for the right reasons, that you push yourself to a level that is unhealthy. And it's always helpful to put boundaries. You know, for me personally, that's what it's all about. It's about the boundaries. And, you know, I have to say, I'm probably lucky that I am not exposed to the hardest of, you know, the you know, the issues, you know, and now I'm working more on strategy, but at the end of the day, you have to treat it as like it's just a job, you know. And I think some people are better at it than others, you know. So, you know, I can't offer a huge amount of tips. Just for me, it's literally like, you know, when it's 6:30, you just switch off your computer, and that's just gotta be it, you know. And it's, for me, it's as simple as that. But, you know, when it comes to trauma, it's much more complicated, and the services and the support needs to be there. But there's definitely stuff happening. Great. So I don't know if there are any other thoughts or questions. You know, I think we have hit 6:30. Sorry, 6:30 in London, where I'm based. Any other last thoughts, questions, or comments?
If there are none, I just came up with this question that I think is a bit more lighthearted, but maybe a nice one to end this on. You mentioned that you presided an international session. If you were to take on such a challenge again, and you were to shape the academic dimension of an international session once again, what human rights issues or what human rights topics would you think are most important for delegates to engage with and discuss in a General Assembly somewhere in Europe?
Great question. You know, I was always the one choosing the Human Rights Committee. Whenever I would see it, I was like, oh, I just want to be part of that. Or draw, you know, right? That's a good question. I do think the issue of how sort of technology and how data is being harvested by tech companies, I think is quite interesting, because it's just quite a murky area at the moment in terms of, you know, essentially people having right to their own content that they put on the internet. I think it's interesting from a privacy perspective, from a freedom of expression perspective. I think it would be really interesting to get, again, a youth perspective on that issue, as the main users in some cases to these to these social media platforms. And it's interesting because I think whenever we work on issues of technology and privacy, the public support is surprisingly low. So people are just, because people just think, oh, I have nothing to hide, so I'm happy to just share my life and my data on these platforms, and then these platforms make a huge amount of money with other people's data, right? So there's something there that would be interesting to explore. So that's one that just comes to mind. God, there are so many. Oh, there's so many. I think I'll just stick with that because I think that's one that's I find is interesting and topical. Yeah, I think austerity, I think, is an interesting one, like in terms of how money is spent by governments from a human rights perspective, I think is interesting. Yeah, there's probably more clever answers in there, but I can't think of any right now. But if you want to ask me ever, I'd be happy to look at any session topics. I used to love that.
I'll be sure to tell the team. I think there's a lot of IS teams who would be grateful for an extra pair of eyes, especially one that has been working so long in the field of human rights. I just wanted to thank you for giving this talk. I think this is just a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about this topic in a very frank and perhaps informal manner, but still, despite informality, it doesn't mean that academically it suffers. I think it's very good to see this kind of interactions. And of course, if you ever want to join an IS team again, we'll make an IS about human rights and we can shape all the topics.
An alumni IS.
An alumni IS, that would be interesting.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Laura. And thanks all. Your questions and thoughts were really interesting. And, if you ever wanted to get in touch, if you have any questions, further questions, or even want to know more about the sector and working for NGOs, please get in touch. I think you could probably find me on LinkedIn, Danny Vannuchi, just add me and drop me a message.
Wonderful. See, that's true interaction between the different EYP generations.
Yeah.
Anyway, to just wrap this up, I will send an email to everyone who joined just to ask how it was. It won't be tonight, but just to evaluate how it went. If you, Danny, want to send the PowerPoint presentation, we can share that as well via email. Might be interesting. And if you have any comments or questions, of course, you can ask them now, but also feel free to approach me at my email address, l.joel@uyp.org. And then I think we can wrap it up.
Great.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice evening, everyone.